At least in the sciences, it's not very useful to say, it's not very helpful to say, is something true or false? Is Newtonian physics true or is it not true? It's not a very fruitful question. It's more fruitful to say, is this theory sufficiently true to be useful? And if you say that, you're begging a question, which is useful for what? And as soon as you start asking useful for what, you're moving into the realm of purpose. What is your purpose? What are you trying to do?
Welcome back to ISSR's In Conversation on the ISSR YouTube channel and podcast. I'm Anthony K. Nairn, Executive Assistant of the International Society for Science and Religion. I am pleased to introduce the ISSR 2023 Book Prize on Science and Religion Winners Discussion. We have hosted this annual event after each respective year's book prize to allow the winners to discuss their books with members of the prize committee and the public. The book prize began in 2020 as an annual prize for the best books in the field of science and religion. Funded by the Templeton World Charity Foundation, the project's aims are threefold. First, to be a catalyst that transforms careers and sparks innovation by making those outside of the mainstream science and religion community, as well as those within it, aware of what a high-quality panel of world-leading experts and others, such as ministers and policymakers, consider to be the best books in the field. Second, to help people realize that outstanding books in the field are written by a wide diversity of authors. And third, to give publicity to books that can help do some good in the world. Each year, we have awarded 3 prizes in distinct categories: academic, general, and professional. ISSR is pleased to have awarded the following authors the 2023 ISSR Book Prize on Science and Religion. In the academic category, the prize went to Jonathan Topham for reading the Book of Nature, how 8 bestsellers reconnected Christianity and the sciences on the eve of the Victorian Age, from University of Chicago Press. In the general readership category, the prize went to Andrew Briggs and Michael Rice for Human Flourishing, Scientific Insight and Spiritual Wisdom in Uncertain Times, from Oxford University Press. And in the category for professionals and educators, the prize went to Donovan Schaefer for Wild Experiment, Feeling Science and Secularism After Darwin, from Duke University Press. This discussion will undoubtedly be helpful to not only those interested in drafting scholarly texts, but also those interested in engaging more deeply with these texts, or issues related to the field of science and religion and scholarly topics more generally. Please enjoy this discussion with the winners of the 2023 ISSR Book Prize on Science and Religion.
So it's my pleasure to welcome you to this discussion of the ISSR Book Prize for 2023. We're a little bit later in doing it than we intended, but better late than never. It's an opportunity for some of the judges who make the decisions to have conversation with the successful authors. And thereby we hope to draw further attention to a set of excellent books. I'm Fraser Watts. I was chair of the Book Prize panel, and I'm joined by my colleagues in the panel, Josh Reeves and Nancy Howell and Russell Manning and John Brooke. And we're going to take the 3 prize-winning books one at a time. One of us is going to lead off the discussion with each of the books. And then at the end, I'm going to say a brief word about one of the other books that we would like to have given the prize to if we'd been able to give more than 3. But we're going to start with reading the Book of Nature, a book by John Topham, and my colleague John Brooke is going to lead off.
Right. Well, hello to everybody, and apologies once again. Jonathan, my first words have to be one of congratulations, and it's a delight to say, as a member of the judging panel, just how gobsmacked I was by the sheer weight of scholarship that lay in your work on the Bridgewater treatises. I made a note, actually, for the sake of everybody who may be watching this, that I ought just to set the scene for a moment. And I found no more succinct way of doing that than actually reading from the flyer of John's book. Flyers aren't always reliable, as we all know. But I would just like to read this because I think it provides a little bit of the background. The point being that this tells everybody what the book is basically about without my asking Jonathan to do that, or without using a deficient summary myself. So, when Charles Darwin returned to Britain from the Beagle voyage in 1836, the most talked about scientific books of the day were the Bridgewater treatises. This series of 8 works was funded by a bequest from the 8th Earl of Bridgewater, and written by leading men of science appointed by the President of the Royal Society. They were to explore, and I quote, the power, wisdom, and goodness of God as manifested in the creation. Securing public attention beyond all expectations, the series offered Darwin's generation a question about, or an answer to, the great questions of the age. How to incorporate the newly emerging disciplinary science into Britain's overwhelming Christian culture. That seems to be a very fair introduction to what this book is about. And all the commentators I have seen have been unanimous in their praise for it. Some of the leading figures in ISSR have described it as vitally important. It offers a new way of thinking and writing about science and religion. So to start and veering towards a question, the Bridgewater treatises are often interpreted simply as works of natural theology because they were obliged to talk about the power, wisdom, and God as manifested in creation. They get a bad press because they were already passé in that respect in the 1830s and seemingly doomed to extinction after Darwin published. But actually, in your book, you have a very different emphasis. And one of the very pithy statements that leapt off the page when I read it was that their books were a godsend for the sciences, not for religious apologetics. And I'd just like you to explain how that can be. How was it possible for these books to be a godsend for the sciences?
Thank you so much, John, for those phenomenally generous words and a very apposite question. In the book, I start answering that question by reference to the very first words in Darwin's Origin of Species, because those words, those very first words, which appear opposite the title page of Origin of Species, are a quotation from one of the Bridgewater treatises, suggesting that God's agency in the universe operates through natural laws rather than miracles. And I pose the question, why would Darwin choose to begin this potentially very controversial book with that quotation? And the claim of the book is that the series had done a huge amount over the preceding generation to reassure a Christian public in Britain particularly that the sciences were religiously safe, that the tendency of men of science to reach for, and I use the gendered term deliberately, this is the conceptualization of the period, that the men of science, that their tendency to reach for natural laws or for long periods of time in their accounts of the history of creation did not undermine Christianity, but was rather consistent with it. So the book then gets into the detail of how that came about. How were the books produced by authors and publishers to achieve these effects? And then the whole of the second half of the book is given over to looking at the way in which readers took the books up in a way that effectively rebaptized the sciences on the eve of the Victorian age. And that, in a sense, then gives me my answer for why Darwin would begin Origin of Species in that way. These are books which everybody knows have shown that the sciences are consistent with Christianity. And therefore, if one is proposing a controversial new theory and can show that it fits in with the insights of the Bridgewater treatises, then one can be assured that a reasonably large proportion of the reading audience will at least pause before condemning that book. And to that extent, they really do function as a godsend for the sciences in that period.
Fine, thank you. Would it be true to say that the science content of these books, which did vary quite a bit from one to another, actually meant that they could be instruments of a scientific education in that period, and that would be another reason why Darwin and his generation would be so familiar with them and saw value in them, despite what they might have thought about the theology?
Oh, assuredly. The treatises do vary a huge amount, as you know very well, John, and they vary considerably in length, the shortest being around 300 pages and the longest being over 1,000. But the scientific content, the way in which it's expressed varies quite significantly. Nevertheless, several of them are books that are really commanding in their account of particular sciences. The one that most obviously comes to mind is William Buckland's work on geology and mineralogy, which really grows out of his Oxford University lectures on the subject. And that work continues to be set as a university textbook even as late as the 1890s, so 60 years later, which is frankly astonishing. And one of the ways in which these books really matter in the context of education is that they show to the world that scientific educators who are using these books and using the reassurance that they offer about the sciences and Christianity, that scientific educators are fulfilling the role that they claim for themselves as appropriate cultural leaders. These are people in whose hands we can trust our young people, our children, our next generation, because as they teach those students the sciences, they will not be disturbing their religious views. They will be working in a way that's consistent with that. And of course, then a whole generation of students comes through Britain's universities, and this is not just Oxford and Cambridge, the great Anglican institutions. It's also, and possibly even more so, the University of Edinburgh or University College London, the so-called godless college. In these institutions, students are learning to engage with the sciences in a way which shows them how that can be done consistently with their religious views.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, who did read these books? It's very clear that in your analysis, you're drawing on all the tools of recent scholarship on the history of the book and the study of print culture, which means that it does have a tremendous scope and sophistication. But there is the question, who was actually reading them, and what kind of use were these books put to, apart from the ones you mentioned already, because it's striking how extraordinary that range of usage turns out to be.
Yes, thank you, John. I'm very proud of that aspect of the book. The whole of the second half is given over to readers, and this is really obviously quite a novel approach still in the history of the sciences. But even before we get to that point, I have an extensive section which looks at the ways in which the Bridgewater treatises reached readers. So these were actually expensive books, and yet they were massively talked about. That's partly because they ended up in all kinds of libraries, whether it be libraries of York Minster or of mechanics institutes. But they also were commented on, excerpted, and discussed in a huge range of periodical publications, including, among other things, the useful knowledge miscellanies of the 1830s, a great new medium in the 1830s, reaching as many as 1 million readers in the case of the Penny magazine, and also in weekly and daily newspapers. So these mechanisms of circulation mean that the books were extremely widely read, discussed, encountered, even if at second hand. And then when we get into the detail of the evidence that I've uncovered of how people engaged with them, we discover that they're being read by children who are being taught by anxious parents about the sciences. And these are books that Christian parents see as a means of teaching their children about science in a way that supports rather than undermines their religious commitments. They're being read by people in their private devotions and in their family devotions. They're being read by courting couples who want to find out whether or not they are religiously suited, whether they're going to make an imprudent match, by married couples who want a way to integrate the public life of the industrialist with the increasingly domesticated life of Victorian women. Equally, they're being read by those engaged in radical disputes about the truth of religion, street radicals, people engaging with Baptist preachers in Halifax and Huddersfield and Bradford. They're being read also by preachers who are preaching not about science and religion, but nevertheless introducing elements from these books into their sermons, so that those sitting in pews, and there are so many of them in the 19th century, hear about the sciences in the context of public worship. I could go on. I'm particularly excited actually about the way in which they're read by practicing scientific figures, Charles Darwin prominent among them, somebody who engages with these books very seriously in the practice of doing science as books that will inform his ideas about how to do science properly, whether or not natural law explanations can be made consistent with Christianity, just what role observation of design should have in the work of science, and what form that should take. And Darwin's not alone in it.
Thank you very much. I think we probably all got a glimpse there of the enormous scope and indeed the erudition which has gone into this book. Just to shift the emphasis slightly, you see the book as arguing for and exemplifying a shift in the way we should approach the history of science and religion. And that is away from a preoccupation with the study of scientific ideas and religious beliefs and whether they are or are not compatible, and that whole range of questions that we're all very familiar with. A shift away from that towards what you describe as a history of science and religion from the ground up, and a more practical view. And I just wondered if you'd like to elaborate that a little bit.
Thank you, John. Yes, I had a growing sense of this, I think, as I wrote the book, and particularly as I encountered the readers. So one of the reasons for taking the readers so seriously was that so many of our histories of science and religion are about men, about learned men, often theologically well educated, and there's a great cast of characters who disappear from these stories, notably women and notably children, notably workers. And in my exploration into the reading of these books, I've encountered those kinds of readers and seen the kinds of concerns that they had. And so often the concerns were not those concerns that we have presumed were prevalent when we thought these were books so much about natural theology and the proving of the existence of God. Their concerns were with feelings, religious feelings. There were concerns with religious values, attitudes, character, behavior, identity, all of these things coming into play. So I think once one starts with that wider cast of characters, one discovers that the story isn't just about the doxic, it's not just about the cognitive, what one believes or thinks. It is about this wider range of aspects of a religious life. So parents are concerned about how to socialize their children into the Christian religion, how to mold their religious feelings, their associations, their character, at least as much as they're concerned about inculcating particular beliefs. Similarly, with scientific practitioners, the question is, what is it to be a Christian man of science? This new public role in the early 19th century that people identify with this new phrase. Does being a man of science mean that you are no longer humble and patient, or can you have those virtues of cultural leaders in a religious nation of being humble and patient? And the conclusion that my protagonists come to is that yes, you can have those things. So I really felt that these different aspects of religion really came to the fore once one got into the nitty-gritty of how people were using and responding to these books.
Yes, I must say I was absolutely taken by the courting couple who were reading a Bridgewater treatise to see whether they were spiritually well matched. It's not a use of the book one would automatically have thought of, I think.
Thank you very much. We've taken our 20 minutes. We should move on now. I'm sorry if there's more you would like to say, but I'm grateful to you both Johns. But we should move on now. And we come next to Human Flourishing by Andrew Briggs and Michael Rice. And my colleague Russell Manning is going to lead off with this one.
Great, thank you, Fraser. I hope you can hear me okay. John Topham made a wonderful reference there to miscellanies of useful knowledge, and I think the book that we're now to talk about is certainly a compendium of useful knowledge. on the theme of human flourishing. Andrew and Michael draw comprehensively from a range of scientific insights and religious or spiritual approaches to the very idea of human flourishing, an idea which I think they feel has not been sufficiently paid attention to in recent discussions, particularly those in the area of science and religion. I'm not going to give a full summary of the book here. It's very nicely constructed. There's a nice symmetry to it, and they identify, amongst other things, 3 dimensions of human flourishing: the material, the relational, and the transcendent dimensions of human flourishing, which they then situate perhaps along a different axis. I'm probably getting my geometry wrong there, but where they talk about 3 pillars of human flourishing. Flourishing does not rest in midair, they say. It is supported by the pillars of truth, of purpose, and of meaning. It's very difficult to live a flourishing life, they affirm, without it resting upon those pillars. And then in conclusion, they turn to the notion of love and applying love, effective love, in the process of the development, I suppose, of human flourishing. So we have both authors here. So I'm not sure how you want to do this, if you're going to take turns or it's interesting to know, of course, about the process of co-authoring as well. But I think I'm going to start off by asking you, on the front cover of my copy, which I think is the same as the one that Fraser has just brandished, there's a lovely quotation from Justin Welby, who describes the book as a careful and thoughtful provocation. And I'm intrigued by that notion of provocation. So, Andrew, Michael, are you being provocative in this book? And if so, how and why?
Michael, you start.
So I'm quite happy with that quotation from Justin Welby. And thank you very much indeed, Russell, for the excellent summary and the nice things you said. I think the way in which I would see it could be defended as being a provocation is, in a sense, it's not a fundamental academic book with one single argument. As you very fairly said, it's a compendium. So certainly my hope was always that for a general reader, which was part of the intended audience, they might not even follow or agree or understand every single page and every single paragraph, but bits of what we've written would indeed provoke thought and possibly provoke feelings and make them either feel quite positive about times in their lives when they have felt good or they have enabled others to flourish, or even possibly cause them to reflect a bit more about, well, what is flourishing and am I flourishing and how could those who matter to me flourish more?
It's quite interesting, that quote, actually. When I sent the text of the book to the Archbishop of Canterbury, normally these things get intercepted by people in his office who sort of collate them, and every, 6 weeks or so, they have a meeting to discuss which books he should provide an endorsement for, and maybe one of them even drafts an endorsement for him. I actually sent the text to him on a Friday, and the following Tuesday, he personally replied, having read it and having himself crafted the endorsement from which that is an excerpt. And you ask how we wrote the book together. Some people ask how we still stayed friends, actually, having written them. And I'm sitting in Northmoor Road in Oxford, in the street where J.R.R. Tolkien lived and wrote the Silmarillion and the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings. And he and C.S. Lewis were great friends. They were part of the Inklings. They used to meet regularly for meals and to read each other work. But they had very different approaches. And C.S. Lewis would write a book, send it off to the publisher, write the next book, send it off to the publisher, and so on. And they were excellent. And J.R.R. Tolkien would write the book, and no, it wasn't quite good enough. He needed to revise it, and then he'd revise it, and no, it still wasn't quite right. And his publisher would be getting more and more frustrated at his failure to deliver. And I'm afraid I'm a bit like J.R.R. Tolkien. Unfortunately, Michael is like C.S. Lewis. I'm really grateful to Michael for being my C.S. Lewis to my Tolkien.
Can I just say quickly, I've heard Andrew very generously make this comparison before, and I've said that possibly one of the nicest things for me about writing this book, of course, has been being compared to C.S. Lewis. I was actually very behind with writing my bits early on. And Andrew was just beginning to wonder when his co-author was going to manage to do the stuff that he'd said he was doing. And then COVID struck and I caught up. But it is true that Andrew did an awful lot more in the last 6 months. When I thought we'd finished it, Andrew kept on wanting to clarify our argument, was it consistent, and so on. And I've always thought the whole point about co-authoring is you should end up with something you couldn't have done on your own, and it is better if you tried. And I'm glad to say I certainly feel that's the case.
I can make a couple more comments, Russell, and then we'll come back to let you ask another question. One of them is this, Michael, I did love writing the book with you. And one of the things that I think made it work so well was that we'd read enough in common that we knew what each other was talking about, but enough different that we could really contribute what the other one would otherwise have been missing if they'd written the book alone. And that for me was a very enjoyable experience. And I think it contributed to the quality of the book. If we go back to Archbishop Justin's comment about provocation, one way of thinking about it is in terms of what's sometimes called appreciative inquiry, where you're not so much trying to give people information that they didn't already have, but to create a sort of context and environment, a stimulus, whereby they can dig into themselves and find what they already have that they can bring out perhaps in ways they hadn't previously thought about or hadn't seen in quite that light. And I very much hope this book will do that for readers, that as they read it, it will stimulate them to think, well, you know, what does it really mean for me to flourish? Not just what would I like, you know, my next employer or whoever to know about me, but what towards the end of my life would make me look back and feel, yes, not just did I flourish, which can be a slightly sort of selfish thing, but how did I contribute to the flourishing of my family, my community, those I care for, and the wider world? And if it has that effect, then the book will have been worthwhile.
Time's marching on. We're halfway through our time, and Russell so far only asked one question. We should ask some more questions.
Thank you, Fraser. Encouraging of thoughtfulness is indeed a welcome provocation. I think. A slightly harder question, if I may. Really focusing on that third dimension. So this is obviously a prize in the area of science and religion, and part of what you claim in the book here is that thinking fully about human flourishing involves engaging with this dimension of transcendence, this transcendent dimension. You acknowledge, I think, in chapter 4 that not everyone would agree with you about this, and you have a rather self-deprecating reference to some highfalutin statements, which is a word we don't hear enough, but are also prepared to respond to some of the sort of nothing buttery of the reductionism. But I wonder if I could push you a bit further on that, that sort of the status and necessity of that transcendent dimension for human flourishing in your account.
Michael, you go again. You always start off so well.
I mean, as I think most people here will know, both Andrew and I have what I would characterize as mainstream conventional Christian faith, and have had that for a long time, and it's central to us. But we were both keen to avoid a book which in any way could be read as being patronizing to a reader who didn't have a religious faith of whatever religion. So the angle I think we took in that particular part of the book on the transcendent dimension was to emphasize that transcendence is available to those who don't have a religious faith as well as to those who do. And we talked, as people usually do in these situations, about the way that music or great literature or nature or staring up into what we still in secular language even call the heavens can often cause people to feel an engagement with something greater than themselves. But of course, for those with a religious faith, nearly always there's another layer of interpreting those phenomena. And that for me has always been quite useful as a way of thinking about it. And to give one quick anecdote, which we didn't put into the book, I always remember when I was about 30-ish, going on a holiday with my father, quite a short holiday, but it was, we were in Italy and we were looking in an art gallery at a Piero della Francesca. And it had the infant Christ and his mother in it. And my father, who was an obstetrician and gynecologist, made a comment which just clearly showed that for him, it was a great painting because here was a young baby, as with any mother, and how she's looking at him. And to me, that made sense, but was only part for me of the way of reading the Piero della Francesca.
I think it does lead naturally into part 2 of the book because of this, that you can start off this awareness of the transcendent. I mean, for me, just doing science in the laboratory, I find what I study calls me to something beyond the material world. That's just my own experience. And I think other people have similar experiences in their own walks of life and in their own ways. And in part 2, we talk about truth and purpose and meaning and seek to articulate the very subtle but essential interplay of objective reality and choices to be made. And we try to show how that's true for each of truth and purpose and meaning. And I'd like, as people read it, for them to reflect back on that for the transcendent. In other words, it seems to me that the appreciation of the transcendent does involve this extraordinary combination of both the objective reality and the subjective choices of where we're going to look for truth, or where we're going to look for transcendence, and how we're going to respond to the experiences and the evidence that we encounter.
Thank you. Yeah, there's so much more we could say there, but I'm going to have to move on and ask. Towards the end of the book, you make reference to existential threats, and part of the framing of the argument of the book is this discussion of human flourishing in uncertain times. You refer, of course, to the doomsday clock and other matters. I wonder really about that sense of the uncertainty, and increasingly we hear talk of sort of pervasive forms of anxiety, of climate anxiety, of the sense of the wickedness of certain problems that face us as a species and as a planet, and so I mean my question really is I mean, well, could you reassure us? Could you say more about the prospects and the dynamics, as it were, for human flourishing in precisely this, what some might cast as a kind of perilous, not just uncertain, but perilous time?
I can comment on something that's become clearer since we wrote that, and then let Michael come in. And what's become clearer since we wrote it is the pervasiveness of uncertainty and even randomness in the physical sciences and in life generally. So you start off with quantum theory and the quantum uncertainty, and there are growing arguments that the randomness there is something basic. It's not something beyond which you could get if you were only better at the science. It's not like that. It's basic. And it's becoming clear that that's also true in non-quantum sciences, such as highly nonlinear systems, weather patterns, atmospheric physics, that there is a randomness there that isn't just because you don't do the calculations accurately enough or because you don't have enough measurement points. It's basic to what's going on. And Tim Mullen's book is on that. And then there's in the economic sciences, John Kay and Mervyn King, former governor of the Bank of England, their book Radical Uncertainty. It just is there in life. So don't get anxious about it. Don't get stressed about it, thinking if only I were cleverer or better or wiser, I could overcome it. It's basic. And whatever your model is for human flourishing must be robust against those vicissitudes of randomness.
And all I'll do is pick up another aspect of what I think I heard you ask, Russell. I was quite struck that when we wrote the chapters on the material and the relational dimensions to human flourishing, a lot of it, frankly, is quite common sense. You know, you don't have enough money up to a certain level, you have poor physical health, you haven't got any friends, all of these things mean you don't flourish as much, however you measure flourishing. But of course, we also have quite a bit, as you may remember having read it, obviously carefully, thank you, Russell, quite a bit to do with existentialism, about where people locate meaning for themselves, even in apparently horrendous situations, whether that literally is in concentration camps or people who've suddenly become paralyzed. And I find it very interesting, this interplay between we are living what seems to be globally in a more threatening time than certainly I thought 25 years ago. But there is still huge potential even within that for people to continue to find purpose, establish meaning, and help themselves and others genuinely to enjoy.
I think that seems like a good place for us to finish this particular section and hand over back to Fraser. Thank you both.
Thank you very much. Thank you all three of you, Andrew, Michael and Russell. But there's a moment if anyone would like to come in with a quick question or comment. There is time for that. Anyone like to do that? This is a book that raises issues of, very general human importance. If I can just make a comment of my own, I think part of the significance of the book is science and religion is looking for a new paradigm after the conflict thesis, which dominated the early years of science and religion. And I think this book sets out probably the most promising alternative paradigm of science and religion not being sort of reaching an edgy reconciliation, but converging perspectives that help to bring about a better human society. And so part of the value for me is in pointing towards a different paradigm for science and religion for the years ahead. So thank you, both authors, for that.
Thank you. Lovely.
Well, thank you, Fraser. And if I can just respond in a sentence or two to that, it happens I'm doing quite a lot now with science in the majority world in the context of science for the global Anglican Communion, particularly with Anglican leaders, bishops and archbishops around the world. And what we're finding there is very much a needs-led approach to the relationship between science and faith. In other words, these are people who, in their sphere of responsibility, have real challenges that they're facing that require the science and the faith to be brought together. So thanks for what you said, and I'm finding empirical evidence for what you've just said around the world.
Yes, I'm not surprised, but good to hear that. So we move on now to the third of the prize-winning book by Donovan Schaefer, Wild Experiment, a rather gripping title, Feeling Science and Secularism After Darwin. And I'm going to hand over to Josh Reeves to start the conversation about this one.
Thank you, everybody. Donovan, first of all, congratulations on a wonderful book that you've written, and the prize award was richly deserved. And so instead of me summarizing the book, I'm going to ask you a few questions in a moment, but I thought I might start off by kind of noting what the committee noted in your book. What we all agreed upon was the qualities that made it a prize-winning book. The first one, I would say the committee first comment was on how wonderfully written the book was. It's very hard to have such vivid images, vivid stories brought together at the highest level of scholarship, and yet it felt like you were reading a much more popular level book at the same time. And that is a very hard skill to pull off. And so I think as a committee, we were all want to compliment you on your ability to write so clearly and vividly in a way that draws the reader in. The second thing the committee really noticed was the impressive range. If you look on the back of the book, it says you draw upon science studies, philosophy, affect theory, secularism studies, psychology, contemporary literary criticism. But honestly, you could probably add a few more things to that list of all the sources that you drew upon. And so, in one chapter, you're drawing upon the journals of Charles Darwin. On the next chapter, you're drawing upon neuroscience. Like, the amount of range that you had was so impressive. And it wasn't just range for range's sake. It was all brought together in a focused way on the topic, which the committee really appreciated. And then I'd say the last comment was just how thought-provoking the book was. I think, as you noted in the book, many people have argued on the intersection between feeling and reason throughout history. You go back to David Hume, you could go back to others, but yet you're clear-eyed thinking through that topic and applying it to modern issues of conspiracy theories, of racism, of the nature of science, modern science technology studies, the way that you could bring that to bear on modern contemporary issues in such a focused way was really impressive. And so for all of these reasons, we wanted to say it was a great achievement, and congratulations, Donovan, on the book. And so let me transition to kind of get the discussion started. And the main thing that you in the book try to challenge is the trying to demarcate reason from emotion, that they're somehow separate spheres. And so as I was reading through, I think, as you know, there have been folks who have argued over the centuries, kind of maybe for a weaker thesis, that reason and emotion are always intertangled with each other and you can't pull them apart. And so that might be a weaker thesis. But it seems to me, and correct me if this is wrong in your book, you're arguing for a stronger thesis, that in some ways thinking is emotion, and that is a much stronger way to think through it. So I thought I'd first invite you to kind of think of, or help explain how you think about the emotion reason nexus that you were discussing in your book.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, first, thank you so much for that incredibly just generous introduction to the book as a whole. I was truly honored by this award. I wasn't trained in a kind of a conventional science and religion track, and I'm something of a latecomer to these conversations. So I really can't underline enough how much of an honor it was to have been considered for this award even. So to your question, I think you're absolutely right. I think that the argument that I found myself making as I was developing this project really was the strong version of the argument. Among certain philosophers, certainly within the field of science and technology studies, which I engaged with a lot, there have been efforts to conversationalize how emotion shapes rationality. With the sense that emotion sometimes shows up, or maybe even often shows up, in order to shape the conclusions that scientists, for instance, might reach, or any academic. I have a kind of capacious sense of science as including all forms of Wissenschaft, all of the different things that we do in any kind of formal knowledge-making context. So there are definitely a lot of approaches that would say sometimes emotion shows up. But I found myself really wanting to zero in on this sense that emotion is always present anytime that we are thinking, just in a kind of basic way. So, I mean, we could talk about that in formal contexts like seminars or conversations like this one, or books. But I think we can also talk about it in informal contexts. I think that this sort of deep interrelatedness of thinking and feeling is something that is really with us all the time. So one of the ideas that I got very interested in was trying to conceptualize an emotion that goes along with feeling like something is the right answer. And the very idea that we can't actually know that something is true unless we have a kind of emotional resonance to that. And actually, I've mentioned this to Andrew before, but a talk that he gave at St. Anne's College way back in 2014 was actually very formative for me, where Andrew talked about the feeling of working on a very difficult problem. Andrew, your work is far above my head, so I'm not going to do an adequate job of explaining it here, but reflecting on a deeply abstract problem in the physical sciences and experiencing the non-resolution of that problem as a kind of pain, and conversely experiencing the resolution of that problem as a kind of pleasure. And I think it might be tempting to say that there's something deeply eccentric about this, that, you know, this is just an unusual story about Andrew Briggs. But I actually think that it's indicative of the way that we are making knowledge all the time. We might not always experience an unresolved problem as pain, but I do think we experience it as frustration. Maybe something that we're, you know, aware of, and maybe something that is just below the threshold of our awareness. But I think that that feeling is there. And I think that that feeling of wanting to fit pieces of information together, what I call click, is something that is always with us. And that was one of the ways that I tried to, I think you put it very, very adroitly in saying that it is a strong version of this idea that thinking and feeling are related.
Yeah. So a follow-up to that. So does that, in your thinking about this, do you think the word reason or rationality or appeals to reason, should we reformulate that language to kind of have a robust, more emotional centric way of understanding it? Or do you feel like the very appeals to reason are so etched with this kind of what you call the kind of cogitation, the more intellectual meaning, that in some ways it's not redeemable, and so we should just kind of stop using that language?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for me, I came to think of something like scientific rationality as a process, something that we can think of as involving a kind of emotional dynamic. When we as scholars write something, we don't just write something and immediately, you know, have unmediated access to an audience. There are all of these stages that we go through in the process of trying to get a message out into the world. And a lot of those stages involve what I would think of as a kind of carefully stage managed hostility, like going through peer review, encountering people who are going to give you a very hard time about things. And so, you know, we all know that on some level, there's a certain amount of excitement that goes along with our work. And I think partly what we've developed in the Academy is a set of procedures for saying, go ahead, get excited, but we're also going to push back on this. We're also going to try to put pressure on this and make sure that you don't get carried away, basically. And what I would say is that I think both sides of that dynamic are emotional. So both the part that says, I'm excited about the ideas, I'm excited about the problems that I'm solving, and the part that says, let's put up some roadblocks here, let's make this, let's try to frustrate these ideas and see if we can think about them another way. That too is a form of emotion. You mentioned Hume. Hume actually has a great model for this. Hume says the way that we conventionally talk about things, this is already, almost 300 years ago, that Hume is saying the conventional wisdom is that we assume it's a matter of reason versus emotion, but it's not. It's a matter of hot passions versus cool passions. On both sides of the equation, you have something like an affective process. So somewhat to my surprise, I actually found myself becoming more bullish about rationality as a term that I think absolutely can be resuscitated as an emotional process. I found myself becoming more skeptical, and I still am not quite sure why this is, of the concept of irrationality. I found it harder and harder to really look at things and say, that is just fundamentally irrational. You might look at something and say, I think you're responding to this situation in a way that is ultimately going to be harmful or unproductive. But that's not quite the same as saying that it's irrational. When people do things, they do things for reasons, even if we might think that those reasons are bad. Very often when I think we're accusing somebody of being irrational, we're really accusing them of being short-sighted. And to me, that's not actually a non-emotional thing. You can be excited about a near-term outcome, or you can be excited about a long-term outcome. They're both forms of rationality, and they're both emotionally infused. A bit of a maybe overly complicated response to your question, but I think it's a wonderful question.
Yeah, that's great. Now, I wouldn't want to give listeners the impression that it's only about the kind of abstract. You really try to apply this to leading contemporary debates. And so I wonder if I could invite you to think about or say more about how your framework would help us think through, say, conspiracy theories or racism. Like maybe pick an issue and show us how your kind of way of thinking about it kind of transforms from kind of a stereotypical assumption to kind of a more a better way of thinking about it.
Yeah, thank you. I was especially honored, I have to say, that the category that I won the ISSR award in was the For Professionals and Educators category. In part because I really hoped that this would be a book that would potentially find its way into science and religion classrooms. I wrote the latter 3 chapters in particular as with a kind of student audience in mind, like trying to get people up on the basics of a conversation and then to think about it a little bit differently. Chapters about Darwin and the Scopes trial and the New Atheism. So, I mean, New Atheism would be an example of this. I think New Atheists, the framing of the New Atheist movement in the 2000s was very much, we are bringing reason back, and we are here to clean the slate of all of the emotional superstition that has risen to kind of claim these kind of public debates, and specifically religion. And there are interesting counterpoints to this. Dawkins's Unweaving the Rainbow is a book that I respond to, which I think talks about the emotional dimensions of science, but doesn't actually go far enough. But in general, the self-presentation of the New Atheist movement was to say, we are here to sweep religious emotionality away through the application of scientific rationality. But I also think that it's uncontroversial in many quarters to say that there was a strong emotional core to the New Atheism. The way that the New Atheist movement set itself up was deeply emotional. And there are parts of the New Atheist project that I agree with. I don't want to just sort of dismiss the entire thing outright. But I think the framing of the New Atheist movement as the supersession of emotion by reason, the triumph of reason, was something that I really wanted to push back on. And so rewriting the story of the New Atheists as a story about dynamics of emotion, including sort of broader societal concerns. Like I talk a lot about Islamophobic racism, for instance, in the New Atheist movement. In putting all of that like in the center of the frame, thinking about the emotional dynamic of this, was part of how I wanted to shift the conversation in that direction.
Yeah. That was very helpful. Thank you, Donovan. I mean, you apply it to so many different issues, and I think that's really one of the strengths of the book. But that was definitely a great example.
I'm glad you think so.
Yeah. One question I had when I was thinking through is oftentimes the way people appeal to the reason emotion is that if it's just emotion, then the question is, how do you choose one position versus another? So I'm thinking something like Jonathan Haidt, the rider and the elephant analogy, where the rider is reason and emotion is the elephant, and you need to kind of like control it in some way. And that if you lose reason as somehow a non-emotional process, then how do you choose? How does emotion make a decision one way or the other? How do we come down on one emotion versus another emotion? If your emotion is this and my emotion is that, then how do we decide unless we have a rider guiding in some way? And so how would you think about that? Would you push back against the metaphor, or would you reinterpret the metaphor? Or how do you exactly do you think about the choosing between different emotional positions?
Yeah, thank you. That's a terrific question. It's funny because I've actually always thought that Haidt's use of that metaphor in Righteous Mind actually kind of undermines the overall point of his book, which I think is much more about in line with what I saw myself as arguing, which is to say that we really can't escape from a kind of fundamental dynamic of emotion when we're making moral decisions. And, you know, he has this sort of elephant rider metaphor, which suggests that on some level, the rider is controlling the elephant, but I'm not actually sure that Haidt believes that. And so I would push back on that metaphor. I don't think that that's quite the right way of thinking about it. Certainly on a basic level, the image of the elephant and the rider, emotion and reason as two separate entities is what I would want to do away with. So in answer to your question of how is it then that we can know that something is right? Well, on one level, I mean, we're going back to this sort of core epistemological question that has been with us, you know, since Kant or before Kant of, do we ever have absolute knowledge? Do we ever have absolute certainty that something is true? And I take the side that would say, no, we don't ever have absolute certainty that something is true or something is false. We have a very robust perspectival knowledge. That perspective, the perspective that we have can be very well developed. But do we ever step outside of our perspective? Do we ever step out of our standpoint? Do we ever step out of our experiencing bodies and know the world in a way that is separate from us as experiencers? I'm on the side, which is a very well-developed side, that would say, no, we don't ever get out of that perspective, that fundamentally perspectival approach. So my solution to that problem, though, is different from a lot of the classical interpretations, which would say you go for something like the best that your rational judgment can offer you, or you go to the best fit to available data. I would simply say, how do you know something is the best? What is it that is indicating to you that something is the best? And I would say that something is ultimately a kind of affective process, that we have a sort of sense of it. That sense can be right, or that sense can be wrong. That sense can lead us to a better understanding of the world, or that sense that something is right can lead us to a worse understanding of the world. But part of my argument is that we will actually understand the world around us better if we understand ourselves as knowers in a more multidimensional way. And we realize that the way that we know the world is shot through with feeling, and that we can't jump outside of this basic template of feeling the world as a way of knowing the world. That's roughly how I would respond to that.
Thank you very much. We should probably move on at that point, but thank you very much, Donovan and Josh. Very interesting conversation. Let me just again give other people a chance to come in with a quick comment if they'd like to.
I just, Donovan, thanks for telling that wonderful story of that great dinner we had at St. Anne's.
Thank you for telling this story. It really got me thinking.
I find myself making links between our three different books, actually. And what you've been saying there links, I think, rather well to what Michael and I wrote about truth in our chapter on truth. Because at least in the sciences, it's not very useful to say, it's not very helpful to say, is something true or false? You know, is Newtonian physics true or is it not true? It's not a very fruitful question. It's more fruitful to say, is this theory sufficiently true to be useful? And if you say that, you're begging a question, which is useful for what? And as soon as you start asking useful for what, you're moving into the realm of purpose. What is your purpose? What are you trying to do? You know, is the theory of phase diagrams of aluminium alloys sufficiently true to be useful for designing airplanes that it's safe to fly? Answer, yes. And so once we've moved into purpose, I think this is beginning, if I've understood rightly, but I'd love you to tell me, is it connecting to what you're writing about?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think there are some really interesting resonances across the whole collection of winners this year. I was thinking too about the question of meaning, and whether this is something I've been really interested in. I think I'm going to do my next project partly on the question of meaning. Is there an emotional dimension to meaning? Can we understand meaning in terms of feeling? And if so, I mean, we can talk about usefulness in terms of, does this particular formula help me to fly planes? Okay. But I think we can also talk about usefulness in terms of, does this particular formula help me solve other problems that are ultimately abstract problems, but are still exciting and are still interesting and have a kind of emotional value in their own right? And is there meaning in that? Is there a kind of emotional meaning in doing science for science's sake? And I would say that there is. I think that that's something that many scientists experience, is the pleasure of the work that they do, independent of the question, which I think is also part of why many scientists work, but independent of the question of, is this going to help us kill cancer cells, fly planes, produce energy more efficiently? Scientists get excited about those things, but I think there's also something that is internal to the intellectual work that we do that has a kind of emotional richness to it. So yes, I'm seeing some very definite kind of handshakes between our projects.
I'm longing for your next book. Please get on with it quickly.
Thank you very much.
Me too.
Thank you for that exchange. And if I can just add a personal comment, it was a book I was delighted to read for kind of autobiographical reasons, because before I moved into science and religion for full time at the age of 48, I'd been working for 12 or 13 years on an MRC unit on feeling science and cognition and emotion. And I think it gradually dawned on me that that wasn't that kind of arbitrary transition, but actually cognition and emotion is an extraordinarily good lens through which to be looking at the relationship between science and religion. And I hadn't got round to writing the book about that I perhaps should have. But then I found yours, and I was delighted to find it, that someone else had written the book I should have written some years before. But so thank you very much for that personal reason. We should, as I mentioned, we had a great field of books last year. It was my third year on the panel of judges, and I think it was tougher this year than in any previous year to make a decision. And we had several very outstanding runners-up, and we were only able to give 3 prizes. And we've invited along one of the runners-up, and we chose someone who was an emerging scholar. And I'd like to just sort of share a moment now to mention this book on Original Sin and the Evolution of Sexual Difference by Megan Alushny. And one of the exciting things about this, and it makes it extraordinarily innovative, is bringing feminist theology into dialogue with Darwinism, which, as far as I know, no one's attempted to do before. We were very excited to find a book doing that. And I wonder if you'd like to tell us just quickly how you came to do that and where you think that might go in the future.
That's great. Thank you so much, Fraser. And I'll apologize. I have a little bit of a cold, so you'll be able to hear that in my voice. But I was also just very honored to receive this award, or not receive an award, but to be listed really among the honorable mentions. And yeah, it meant so much to me. So thank you for that. And thank you for the excitement about this project as well. I think in my reading of the field that feminist philosophy is a little bit ahead of feminist theology on this, bringing together or sort of seeing Darwin as potentially as a resource, and even going beyond Darwin into kind of contemporary scientific accounts. I see more of this happening in feminist philosophy. So I was looking for really a book as a theologian that would take up questions of sexual difference, engaging with the sciences and also with theological sources. And I wasn't able to find what I was looking for. So that's, as is so often the case, what led me to write my own book, is thinking, I wish this book was out there. So I guess I have to write it. So yeah, I think there's really a lot more work to be done on the part of theologians in particular in seeing Darwin, but also the sciences beyond Darwin as offering something useful for, in particular, theological consideration of questions about sexual difference, but other questions as well about what it means to be human. And so I hope that there will be a lot more after this of people, feminist theologians, feeling like they can engage with the sciences. I think what I've seen in feminist theology mostly is critiques of Darwin, or even beyond that, critiques of how the sciences have contributed to oppressive ways of thinking about gender and sexual difference. And those have been really valuable, and I think we need those. But I think also we could go a step further and try to look more creatively at some of these sources to see beyond critique, is there something there that we could retrieve that might actually be useful for some feminist purposes. So that was my hope, and I do hope that there will be other feminist theologians in particular who feel empowered by this book also to engage with the sciences.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
So that's really the end of the discussion of the books in the 2023 prize. The prize was set up for 5 years in the first place. We're hoping to find the resources to continue it beyond that, but there will be at least one more year of the book prize, 2024, and nominations are being received at the moment. So if there's a book you want to nominate, do send it in to Anthony Nairn. And I think I'd like to end just by quoting a few words from the agreement that set up the book prize. Threefold aims in this book prize: to be a catalyst that transforms careers and sparks innovation, to help people realize that outstanding books in this field are written by a wide diversity of authors, and third, to give publicity to books that can help do some good in the world. I think we have a set of books this year that have achieved those objectives splendidly. So I congratulate the prize-winning authors and many others, and thank you for being part of this conversation today. Thank you.
If you like what you watched or listened to here, please leave a like and consider subscribing to the ISSR YouTube channel or our podcast for more content on scholarly topics related to the field of science and religion. The info box below will contain links to the authors and their books from their respective publishers' websites, members of the prize committee, and information on the book prize. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time on ISSR in Conversation.